Lazy proof. How to build an unshakable work drive without willpower. Written and narrated by MSE Boost. You've been told your entire life that success comes down to how badly you want it. Push through the resistance. Dig deeper. Find that fire inside you and force yourself to do what needs to be done. This advice sounds inspiring when you hear it from a stage or read it on a motivational poster, but it has a devastating flaw that nobody talks about. It doesn't actually work for sustained periods of time. The people giving you this advice either got lucky with their brain chemistry, forgot how they actually built their habits, or are selling you something. Willpower, that mythical inner strength you've been told to summon on demand, is perhaps the most unreliable tool you could possibly choose to build your work ethic around. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. Willpower does work in short bursts. You can white-knuckle your way through a deadline. You can force yourself to the gym for a week. You can resist the snooze button on a Monday morning after a particularly inspiring Sunday night planning session. These small victories feel like proof that the willpower approach is valid. They reinforce the belief that when you fail to perform, the problem is simply that you didn't try hard enough. So you resolve to try harder next time, and the cycle continues. But those bursts of forced effort never compound into lasting change because the resource you're drawing from has a limit, and you keep hitting it. Chapter 1. The Willpower Lie. The distinction that will reshape how you approach work isn't complicated, but it runs counter to almost everything popular culture teaches about success. There are two fundamentally different ways to get yourself to do things. The first is to rely on internal force, willpower, motivation, discipline, whatever word you prefer. The second is to restructure your life so that the behavior you want becomes the path of least resistance. These two approaches look similar from the outside. Both can produce someone who shows up and does the work, but they operate on completely different principles, and only one of them is sustainable. This book is about the second approach, and this chapter is about why the first one keeps failing you. Willpower functions more like a battery than a personality trait. Each decision you make, each impulse you resist, each task you force yourself to complete, drains some of that charge. The drain happens whether the decision is important or trivial. Choosing what to eat for breakfast, resisting the urge to check your phone, making yourself start that report you've been avoiding, all of these pull from the same limited pool. By the time you've navigated a typical morning in a modern life filled with choices and temptations and demands, you've already spent a significant portion of your daily willpower budget before your most important work even begins. This isn't a metaphor or a motivational framework. Researchers have spent decades studying this phenomenon, and while the scientific community debates some of the finer details, the practical reality remains consistent across studies. People make worse decisions when they're cognitively depleted. They give in to temptations they would have easily resisted earlier in the day. They take shortcuts. They procrastinate. They choose the easier option over the better option. If your strategy for building a strong work ethic relies on consistently accessing a resource that depletes throughout each day, you've built your system on an inherently unstable foundation. Consider how this plays out across longer time horizons. Stress depletes willpower faster. Poor sleep depletes it. Emotional difficulty, financial pressure, relationship problems, health issues, all of these accelerate the drain. The very circumstances that make strong work ethic most necessary are precisely the circumstances that make willpower least available. When your life is going smoothly, you might be able to force yourself through tasks with reasonable consistency. But life rarely stays smooth for long, and a work ethic that only functions under ideal conditions isn't really a work ethic at all. The depletion effect compounds over weeks and months in ways that create a particularly cruel pattern. You start a new system with high motivation. Maybe you've read a book or watched a video or had a wake-up call about your career trajectory. Your willpower stores are temporarily boosted by novelty and urgency. You perform well for a while, days, maybe even weeks. This feels like evidence that you finally figured it out. Then gradually, invisibly, the reserve starts running low. The effort required to maintain your new behaviors begins to exceed what you can reliably produce. Small slips appear. You miss a day, then two. The system that was working starts to crumble, and within a month or two, you're back to your old patterns, perhaps with an additional layer of discouragement about your apparent inability to change. What makes this cycle so persistent is that each failure reinforces the wrong conclusion. You tried and failed, so clearly you need to try harder next time. You need more motivation, more discipline, a stronger commitment. But adding more force to a depleting resource doesn't solve the underlying problem. It just guarantees a harder crash when the inevitable depletion occurs. You cannot willpower your way to lasting behavioral change any more than you can sprint your way through a marathon. The tool is fundamentally mismatched to the task. Motivation presents a related but distinct problem, where willpower is about forcing yourself to do things you don't want to do. Motivation is about wanting to do them in the first place. The advice to find your why or connect to your purpose assumes that if you can just access enough motivation, the work will flow naturally. This sounds reasonable until you examine how motivation actually behaves in real-world conditions. Motivation is not a stable resource you can reliably access. It fluctuates based on factors largely outside your conscious control. Sleep quality, hormonal cycles, weather, recent successes or failures, blood sugar levels, social interactions, and dozens of other variables. Some days you wake up ready to conquer your to-do list, and other days the same list feels like an insurmountable burden. The tasks haven't changed. Your purpose hasn't changed. Your goals remain exactly as important as they were yesterday, but the felt sense of motivation has shifted, and suddenly everything is harder. Building your work ethic around motivation means building it around something that shows up unpredictably and leaves without warning. You become hostage to a feeling that you cannot summon on command. When motivation is present, you perform well and feel confident that you've finally developed discipline. When it vanishes, and it always vanishes eventually, you're left with nothing but confusion about why you can't seem to maintain what felt so natural just days ago. The particularly destructive element of motivation dependence is how it trains you to interpret your own behavior. When you work well, you attribute it to having strong motivation, which feels good but teaches you nothing useful about replication. When you fail to work, you attribute it to lacking motivation, which feels bad and also teaches you nothing useful. Both interpretations miss what's actually happening, which is that you've made your output dependent on an emotional state rather than on systems that function regardless of emotional state. The alternative to forcing behavior is engineering behavior. This distinction is the conceptual foundation everything else in this book builds upon, so it's worth examining carefully. Forcing behavior means relying on internal resources, willpower, motivation, discipline, to overcome resistance and make yourself act. The locus of control is inside your head. You're essentially trying to win an ongoing battle against your own impulses, preferences, and comfort-seeking tendencies. Sometimes you win these battles. Often you lose. The outcome depends heavily on factors you don't control, like how depleted you are, what else is demanding your mental resources, and whether your mood happens to cooperate. Engineering behavior means structuring your external environment, your schedule, your tools, and your systems so that the desired action becomes the default option. Instead of fighting against the current of your natural tendencies, you redirect the current. The locus of control shifts from your internal state to your external setup. Your success depends not on having exceptional willpower, but on having designed your circumstances intelligently. This shift in approach changes everything about how you relate to work. When you're forcing behavior, each work session is a fresh battle that you may or may not win. When you've engineered behavior, each work session is a natural consequence of the system you've built. The former is exhausting and unreliable. The latter is sustainable and, once established, largely automatic. Think about behaviors you already perform consistently without any willpower expenditure. You brush your teeth without an internal struggle. You lock your door when you leave home. You wear clothes in public. These behaviors don't require motivation because they're so deeply embedded in your routines, environment, and identity that doing otherwise would actually require effort. The goal of behavioral engineering is to move your work habits into this same category, to make showing up and delivering require less mental energy than avoiding and procrastinating. The systems you'll build in subsequent chapters target 3 specific domains: your physical environment, your task structure, and your self-concept. Each domain offers powerful levers for reducing the willpower cost of productive work, and the 3 domains reinforce each other when addressed together. Environmental engineering addresses the friction that makes starting work harder than it needs to be. Every obstacle between you and productive action, whether it's a cluttered desk, a distant workspace, an inconvenient schedule, or the presence of tempting distractions, costs willpower to overcome. These costs seem small individually, but they accumulate across the day and across the weeks. Removing friction from desired behaviors while adding friction to undesired behaviors creates a landscape that naturally channels your energy toward productivity. Task structure engineering addresses how you engage with the work itself. The way you break down projects, the order in which you tackle tasks, the methods you use for starting and maintaining focus, all of these can be designed to minimize resistance. Most people approach tasks in whatever way feels intuitive in the moment, which usually means approaching them in whatever way is easiest rather than whatever way is most effective. Intelligent task design makes the effective approach also feel easy. Identity engineering addresses the deepest layer, who you believe yourself to be. Your self-concept exerts tremendous influence over your behavior, often without your awareness. People tend to act in accordance with their beliefs about themselves, which means that changing your actions while leaving your identity unchanged creates constant internal tension. Building new behaviors becomes dramatically easier when those behaviors align with who you see yourself as, and your self-concept is more malleable than you probably realize. There's a reason the willpower myth persists despite its obvious failure rate. It flatters certain values that our culture holds dear: personal responsibility, individual grit, the ability to triumph through sheer determination. Suggesting that success depends on system design rather than inner strength can sound like an excuse, a denial of agency, a way of letting people off the hook for their failures. But this framing misunderstands what behavioral engineering actually requires. Designing effective systems takes effort. It demands that you analyze your own patterns honestly, experiment with different approaches, and make changes that might feel uncomfortable initially. It requires you to think rather than simply to try harder. None of this is easy, and none of it lets you off any hooks. The difference is that the effort you invest goes toward building something sustainable rather than toward fighting the same battle over and over again. Personal responsibility under this framework shifts from "I must summon the willpower to do this" to "I must design my life so that doing this becomes natural." The second form of responsibility is actually more demanding in some ways. It doesn't let you off with the excuse that you just didn't want it badly enough. It asks you to take concrete action to change your circumstances rather than waiting for motivation to strike. It treats your behavior as a solvable engineering problem rather than a test of moral character. The people who consistently show up and deliver, the ones who seem to have superhuman work ethic, rarely describe themselves as winning daily willpower battles. When you actually talk to high performers about their habits, a different picture emerges. They've structured their mornings so that work happens before distractions have a chance to intervene. They've arranged their environments so that their tools are ready and their temptations are distant. They've built routines so ingrained that breaking them would require more effort than following them. What looks from the outside like extraordinary discipline is often ordinary systems that have made discipline largely unnecessary. Letting go of the willpower approach can feel like giving up, like admitting defeat in some fundamental way. If you've spent years trying to force yourself to work harder, adopting a different framework means accepting that all those attempts were misdirected. That's an uncomfortable thing to acknowledge, especially if you've been hard on yourself for your repeated failures. But consider what you're actually giving up. You're giving up an approach that has demonstrably not worked. You're giving up the cycle of resolve, effort, depletion, and failure that you've probably repeated dozens or hundreds of times. You're giving up the self-criticism that comes from believing your failures are evidence of weak character. In exchange, you're gaining access to methods that work with human psychology rather than against it. The self-criticism piece deserves particular attention. When you believe that work ethic is purely a matter of willpower, every failure becomes a moral failure. You didn't just underperform, you revealed something shameful about your character. This interpretation makes each slip feel catastrophic, which paradoxically makes recovery harder. Shame is not an effective motivator for sustained behavior change. It creates avoidance rather than engagement. It makes you want to hide from the task rather than address it. Reframing work ethic as a design problem rather than a character test allows you to evaluate your failures differently. When you don't show up the way you wanted to, the relevant question isn't, "What's wrong with me?" but "What's wrong with my system?" This question leads somewhere productive. It opens up a path of analysis and adjustment rather than a spiral of self-recrimination. And it positions you to actually solve the problem rather than just feel bad about it. The chapters ahead will get specific about how to redesign each element of your work life. You'll learn concrete techniques for restructuring your environment, your task approach, and your self-concept. But the techniques only work if you first accept the premise that makes them necessary. Willpower is not going to save you. This isn't pessimism, it's liberation. Every time you've blamed yourself for not trying hard enough, you were wrong about what the problem actually was. Every time you resolved to finally get serious and push through, you were applying more force to a strategy that fails by design. Every time you felt like there was something fundamentally defective about your capacity to work hard, you were confused about what produces hard work in the first place. The confusion is understandable. You were given bad advice by well-meaning people who didn't know any better, and you internalize beliefs about effort and discipline that actively interfere with sustained productivity. Unlearning those beliefs takes time. There will be moments in the chapters ahead when the old voice pipes up, telling you to just try harder, to stop making excuses, to summon the willpower and push through. Recognize that voice for what it is, an outdated strategy that has already failed you repeatedly and will continue to fail you for as long as you listen to it. What replaces it isn't laziness or lowered standards. It's intelligence applied to the problem of behavior change. It's working with your psychology instead of against it. It's building systems that don't require you to win a daily battle against yourself. The people who seem to have unshakable work drive didn't develop it by trying harder than everyone else. They developed it by making the work easier to do than to avoid. That's the approach you're about to learn, and it changes everything. Chapter 2. Designing your default settings. Your environment is making decisions for you before you even wake up. The layout of your bedroom, the location of your phone, the contents of your desk, the structure of your morning. All of these factors are quietly determining whether you'll work with focus or fritter away hours without noticing. Most people treat their surroundings as neutral backdrops to their willpower struggles, completely missing that the backdrop itself is the primary driver of their behavior. The arrangement of objects and spaces around you isn't just decoration. It's a system of invisible prompts, constantly suggesting what you should do next. This is either very bad news or very good news, depending on how you respond to it. If you continue ignoring your environment while trying to force productivity through sheer determination, you're fighting against a current that never stops flowing. But if you learn to redesign your surroundings intentionally, you gain access to a source of influence that works around the clock without draining your mental resources. The shift from willpower-dependent work to environment-supported work begins with understanding that your physical space is not passive. It's an active participant in everything you do or fail to do. What you're about to learn is how to audit your current environment for hidden obstacles, how to strategically restructure your spaces to make productive behavior effortless, and how to install triggers that automatically activate your work mode. These aren't complicated techniques. And they don't require expensive equipment or major life changes. They require you to see your surroundings differently, as a machine that can be tuned rather than a fixed reality you must endure. By the end of this chapter, you'll have a concrete plan for turning your environment from an obstacle course into a launch pad. Friction is the hidden force that shapes most of your daily choices. The term refers to any obstacle, however small, that stands between you and an action. A book left across the room has more friction than a book on your nightstand. A gym that requires a 15-minute drive has more friction than a set of dumbbells in your closet. A work task that requires you to first find the right file, then open 3 applications, then wait for things to load, has more friction than a task where everything is already prepared and waiting. Your brain is constantly performing unconscious calculations about the effort required for various actions. When friction is low, you're likely to do something. When friction is high, you're likely to avoid it, even if you genuinely want to do it. These calculations happen below your awareness, which is why you can have every intention of being productive and still end up scrolling social media for an hour. The scrolling required almost no friction. Your phone was right there, the apps were ready, your thumb knew exactly where to go. The work required finding materials, making decisions about where to start, and pushing through initial resistance. Your brain chose the lower friction option without consulting you. This isn't a character flaw. This is how human cognition operates. We're wired to conserve energy, which means we naturally gravitate toward easy actions and away from difficult ones. The solution isn't to somehow override this wiring through willpower. That's the approach that already failed. The solution is to redesign your environment so that the easy actions are the ones you want to take. Removing friction from desired behaviors means systematically identifying and eliminating every obstacle between you and productive work. Some of these obstacles are obvious once you look for them. Others are subtle enough that you've never consciously noticed them, even though they've been undermining you for years. The goal is to make starting work so easy that it requires less effort than avoiding work. Consider what happens when you sit down to work on a typical day. Where are the things you need? How many actions must you take before you can actually begin? Each action is a potential exit point, a moment where your brain can decide that something else seems more appealing. If you have to clear a cluttered desk, find your notes, open your laptop, launch several programs, and then stare at a blank document trying to remember where you left off, you've created 5 or 6 opportunities for your mind to wander toward distractions. Most people never begin their actual work because they get derailed somewhere in the preparation phase. The fix is to prepare your environment in advance so that beginning requires virtually no activation energy. This means ending each work session by setting up the next one. Leave your desk clean with only the materials you'll need tomorrow. Close all browser tabs except the ones relevant to your next task. Write a single sentence describing exactly what you'll work on when you return, so you don't have to spend mental energy remembering or deciding. Position your chair pulled in and your workspace ready, so that sitting down flows seamlessly into working. This preparation might seem minor, but its effects compound dramatically. When starting work requires just sitting down and looking at your screen, the gap between intention and action shrinks to almost nothing. There's no space for resistance to build, no moment where your brain can redirect you towards something easier. You've removed the friction that normally stands between you and productivity. Adding friction to undesired behaviors is the other half of the equation. Just as you can make productive actions easier, you can make unproductive actions harder. The goal is to create obstacles that interrupt the automatic slide toward distraction without requiring you to resist temptation through willpower. Your phone is probably the single largest source of unproductive, friction-free behavior in your life. It sits within arm's reach, ready to deliver unlimited entertainment with a single tap. The apps on it have been engineered by teams of specialists whose entire job is to make using them as frictionless as possible. You cannot compete with that level of optimization through willpower alone, but you can add friction that breaks the automatic pattern. Physical distance is the simplest form of friction. A phone in another room pulls on your attention far less than a phone on your desk. You might tell yourself that you need it nearby for emergencies, but honest assessment usually reveals that the emergencies requiring instant phone access are rare to non-existent. The constant distraction, on the other hand, is guaranteed. Moving your phone to another room during work hours adds friction by making access require getting up, walking, and consciously deciding to check it. A very different experience from the mindless grab and scroll that happens when it's within reach. If physical distance isn't possible, technological friction can help. Most phones now have focus modes or app timers that make accessing distracting apps more difficult. These tools add friction by requiring extra actions before you can use the apps, confirming that you really want to, waiting through a delay, or acknowledging that you've exceeded your limit. These small barriers are often enough to break the automatic pattern and give you a moment to reconsider. Your computer presents similar challenges. Browser tabs, notifications, and easy access to entertainment create a constant pull away from work. Friction can be added through browser extensions that block distracting sites during set hours, through disabling notifications on all but essential applications, and through logging out of social media accounts so that accessing them requires entering passwords. Each additional action required becomes a moment of potential reconsideration. The principle extends beyond digital distractions. If you're trying to eat healthier, making junk food hard to access, keeping it out of the house, putting it on high shelves, requiring unwrapping or preparation, adds friction that interrupts automatic consumption. If you're trying to watch less television, unplugging the TV or removing batteries from the remote creates friction that makes you pause before defaulting to the couch. Every behavior you want to reduce can be made harder through strategic friction. Some people resist this approach because it feels like treating themselves as untrustworthy children. But this framing misses the point. You're not distrusting yourself. You're acknowledging how human attention and motivation actually function and designing accordingly. The people who seem to have superhuman discipline aren't constantly resisting temptation. They've structured their lives so that temptation rarely presents itself. The discipline isn't in the moment of resistance. It's in the advanced decision to remove the need for resistance. Your physical workspace sends constant signals to your brain about what kind of behavior is appropriate. A cluttered, chaotic space signals that scattered, unfocused activity is normal here. A clean, organized space signals that concentrated, intentional work belongs here. These signals operate below conscious awareness, which is why you can feel unfocused without understanding that your environment is contributing to the feeling. The visual information in your surroundings competes for attention whether you want it to or not. Every object in your peripheral vision is being processed by your brain, consuming cognitive resources that could otherwise support your work. Clutter creates a constant low-level drain on mental energy. You might not notice this drain because it's always present, but its effects accumulate throughout the day, leaving you more depleted than a cleaner environment would. Clearing your workspace means removing everything that isn't directly relevant to the task at hand. Papers for other projects, personal items, unrelated books, decorative objects, all of these can be stored elsewhere during work hours. The goal is to create a visual field where the only objects are those supporting your current focus. This isn't about aesthetic minimalism or denying yourself personality in your space. It's about reducing the cognitive load that comes from processing irrelevant visual information. The objects you do keep in your workspace should be chosen intentionally. The tools you need for your work should be visible and accessible. Everything else should be hidden or removed. This selectivity ensures that when you look at your desk, your attention is guided toward productive action rather than pulled in competing directions. The lighting in your workspace affects your mental state more than you probably realize. Dim lighting tends to promote relaxation and sleepiness, while brighter lighting supports alertness and focus. Natural light is preferable when available, but adjustable artificial lighting can compensate. Pay attention to how different lighting conditions affect your ability to concentrate and adjust accordingly. Temperature plays a similar role. Spaces that are too warm promote drowsiness, while spaces that are slightly cool tend to support sustained attention. If you don't have control over your room temperature, layers of clothing can help you regulate how you feel. The goal is to find the conditions that support your best focus and then maintain them consistently. Noise is the third major environmental factor affecting concentration. Some people work best in silence, while others find that moderate background noise actually helps focus by providing a consistent auditory texture. If silence leaves you restless, ambient sound generators or instrumental music can provide stimulation without distraction. If noise from others is unavoidable, noise-canceling headphones create a bubble of controllable sound. The key is to identify what works for you and then engineer that condition into your workspace. Environmental cues can be designed to trigger specific mental states automatically. This is how you move from merely reducing obstacles to actively promoting the work mode you want. Your brain is constantly responding to signals in your environment, associating particular contexts with particular behaviors and feelings. These associations can be deliberately created and strengthened until entering a certain space or beginning a certain routine automatically activates focused attention. The concept is familiar, even if you've never thought about it explicitly. There are places where you feel relaxed without trying to relax. Your bedroom, a favorite cafe, a park bench you've sat on many times. There are places that make you feel alert and serious. A courtroom, a hospital, a formal office. These feelings aren't random. They're the result of repeated associations between those environments and particular mental states. You can create the same kind of association with your workspace. The key is consistency. If your work happens in a dedicated space, used only for work, your brain begins to associate that space with working. Entering it becomes a trigger for the focused mental state you need. The association strengthens each time you work there and weakens each time you use the space for other purposes. This is why mixing work and leisure in the same space creates problems. The cues become confused, and the environment fails to trigger any particular state. If you don't have a dedicated workspace, you can create portable cues that travel with you. A specific type of music or ambient sound that you only play during work can become a trigger. A particular object placed on your desk, a small statue, a specific notepad, a lamp turned on, can signal that work time has begun. Even a physical posture like sitting upright in a particular way can serve as a cue that activates focus. The specific choice matters less than the consistency of the association. Rituals can serve as transition cues that help you move from one mental state to another. A short sequence of actions performed before starting work, making tea, arranging your desk in a particular way, reading over yesterday's notes, taking 3 deep breaths, can become a reliable trigger for the focused state you need. The ritual doesn't need to take long. Even a 30-second routine, performed consistently, builds an association that helps you enter work mode on command. The triggering effect strengthens over time. Early on, you might perform your ritual and still feel scattered. With repetition, the association deepens until the ritual becomes a reliable switch that moves you from distraction to focus. This is the long-term payoff of environmental cueing. The ability to enter productive mental states without struggling to summon motivation. Your schedule is part of your environment, even though you might not think of it that way. The structure of your day determines when you encounter different activities, how they're sequenced, and how much decision-making is required to navigate from one to the next. A well-designed schedule reduces the willpower cost of staying on track, while a poorly designed schedule creates constant decision points where you can be derailed. Decision fatigue is the reason why scheduling matters. Each time you have to decide what to do next, you consume mental resources. By midday, you've made hundreds of decisions, and your capacity for good judgment has degraded. If your schedule requires you to constantly decide what task to tackle next or when to take breaks, you're spending energy on administration that could otherwise support your actual work. Pre-deciding eliminates this problem. When your schedule specifies what you'll be doing at each hour, you don't have to make choices in the moment. You simply follow the plan. This isn't about rigid micromanagement of your time. It's about removing unnecessary decisions that drain you. The structure frees you, rather than constraining you, because it takes the burden of choice off your depleted mind. The most important scheduling decision is when to place your most demanding work. This is where understanding your own energy patterns matters. Most people have times of day when their focus and energy are naturally higher, and times when they're naturally lower. Placing your hardest tasks during your peak hours and your easier tasks during your low hours is obvious in theory, but many people do the opposite, starting with easy tasks and leaving hard ones for later when their energy is depleted. Protecting your peak hours from interruption is crucial. These are the hours when you're most capable of deep, focused work, and they're limited. Meetings, administrative tasks, communications, and other low-intensity activities can happen during your lower energy periods. Your peak hours should be reserved for the work that actually matters, the work that moves your goals forward and requires your full mental capacity. Transitions between tasks deserve attention in your schedule. Switching from one type of work to another incurs a cognitive cost as your brain adjusts to new demands. Clustering similar tasks together reduces this cost. If you have several communications to send, doing them in a block is more efficient than scattering them throughout the day. If you have creative work that requires focus, protecting an uninterrupted block of time serves you better than trying to do it in fragments between other obligations. Your schedule should include explicit endings, not just beginnings. Knowing that work ends at a particular time changes your relationship with the work that happens before that time. Open-ended schedules tend to produce procrastination because there's always more time available later. Fixed endpoints create healthy pressure to use the available time well. They also protect your recovery time, which matters for sustained productivity across days and weeks. The environment outside your workspace also affects your work inside it. The state of your living space, your morning routine, and even your evening habits the night before all contribute to how you show up when work time arrives. Disorder in your living space creates a background cognitive load that follows you into your work. If your morning involves navigating through clutter, hunting for things you need, and dealing with deferred decisions about household tasks, you arrive at your workspace already somewhat depleted. The mental energy spent on these environmental problems isn't available for productive work. Preparing your living space and your morning routine with the same friction-reducing principles that apply to your workspace can make a substantial difference. Choosing your clothes the night before, having breakfast decisions already made, knowing exactly where your keys and wallet are. These small preparations eliminate the dozens of micro-decisions that otherwise accumulate before your workday even begins. Sleep environment deserves particular attention because the quality of your sleep determines the resources you'll have available the next day. A cool, dark, quiet bedroom with a consistent sleep schedule supports recovery more than a chaotic sleep environment with irregular timing. The willpower and focus you rely on during the day are replenished during sleep. Undermining your sleep undermines everything else. Evening routines affect the next day more than most people realize. What you do in the hours before sleep influences both sleep quality and your mental state upon waking. Screens, stressful content, heavy food, and stimulating activities close to bedtime can all degrade your recovery. Protecting a wind-down period, even a short one, before sleep helps ensure that tomorrow's version of you has the resources needed to perform. Making environmental changes stick requires understanding why previous attempts at changing your space might have failed. The most common failure mode is treating environmental design as a one-time project rather than an ongoing practice. You reorganize your desk with great enthusiasm, feel productive for a week, and then gradually watch entropy reclaim your space until you're back where you started. Entropy is the natural tendency toward disorder. Left unattended, organized spaces become cluttered, clean surfaces accumulate objects, and carefully designed systems break down. This isn't a personal failure, it's physics. Maintaining an optimized environment requires regular maintenance, just like maintaining physical fitness or a clean home. Building maintenance into your routines prevents the gradual degradation. A few minutes at the end of each work session to reset your workspace for tomorrow costs almost nothing, but prevents the slow accumulation of disorder. A weekly review of your environment to address any emerging problems catches issues before they become entrenched. These maintenance practices are investments in your future self, ensuring that the environment you've designed continues to support you. The other common failure is attempting too much change at once. Completely redesigning your environment in a single weekend sounds appealing but often backfires. The changes feel overwhelming, you struggle to maintain all of them, and you eventually abandon the project entirely. A more sustainable approach is to change one thing at a time, verify that the change is working, and then add another. Gradual optimization beats ambitious transformation that doesn't stick. Putting these principles into practice means looking at your current environment with fresh eyes. Walk through a typical workday and notice where friction appears. When do you struggle to start? Where do distractions pull you away? What in your environment supports focus, and what undermines it? These observations will reveal your highest priority targets for change. Your initial changes should focus on removing the most obvious sources of friction and distraction. Move your phone during work hours. Clear your desk of irrelevant objects. Close unnecessary browser tabs. Block distracting websites. These changes require minimal effort to implement but can produce immediate benefits. They also give you early wins that build momentum for more substantive changes. From there, you can begin designing triggers and rituals that help you enter work mode reliably. Choose a cue, a specific piece of music, a physical arrangement, a brief routine, and use it consistently at the start of work sessions. Don't worry if the effect isn't strong initially. With repetition, the association will strengthen until the cue becomes a reliable switch for focused attention. Your schedule deserves review with the same critical eye you've applied to your physical space. Where are you placing your most important work? Are your peak hours protected or fragmented by interruptions? Have you structured your day to minimize decisions, or does navigating each day require constant choice-making? Adjusting your schedule to align with these principles costs nothing but can dramatically change how much quality work you produce. The changes you make to your environment won't solve every problem. You'll still have days when focus is hard to find, when resistance is high, when the work simply doesn't want to flow. But those days will become rarer, and recovering from them will become easier. You'll no longer be fighting against your surroundings, while also fighting against your own psychology. The environment that once worked against you will be working with you, quietly supporting the productivity you want without demanding constant willpower expenditure. That support, compounding across days and weeks and months, creates results that seem impossible from where you currently stand. Chapter 3. The Momentum Method. Starting is the hardest part. You already know this from experience. The way a task can loom for hours or days while you circle around it, the strange heaviness that settles over you when it's time to begin, the sudden appeal of literally anything else. Most productivity advice acknowledges this difficulty and then tells you to push through it anyway. Summon your discipline. Force yourself to start. Just do it. But you've tried that approach, and you know where it leads. The push-through strategy works occasionally, fails frequently, and never addresses the underlying problem. You're trying to generate motion from a standstill, which is the most energy-intensive way to move. Physics offers a better model. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest, and objects in motion tend to stay in motion. The energy required to begin movement far exceeds the energy required to maintain it once it's started. This principle applies directly to your work. Getting started demands enormous willpower. Continuing work that's already flowing requires far less. The implication is clear. If you can find ways to start with minimal resistance, you'll have more resources available for everything that follows. The goal isn't to become better at forcing starts. The goal is to make starts so easy they barely register as effort. This chapter gives you specific techniques for entering work with almost no activation energy, building momentum through early wins, sustaining focus through the challenging middle portion of tasks, and finishing with intention rather than fading out. These aren't vague principles. They're concrete protocols you can implement today. The environment you designed in the previous chapter removed external obstacles. Now, you'll learn to remove the internal obstacles that remain. The entry point you choose for any task determines how much resistance you'll face when starting. Most people approach tasks by looking at the whole thing and then trying to begin. They open the document and stare at the blank page. They look at the project scope and feel overwhelmed. They think about all the work ahead and feel exhausted before they've even started. This is not a failure of willpower. This is a failure of task design. Your brain processes upcoming work and generates resistance proportional to the perceived effort required. A large, undefined task triggers substantial resistance because your mind anticipates substantial effort. A small, clearly defined action triggers minimal resistance because your mind anticipates minimal effort. The task itself hasn't changed, only the way you framed your entry into it. By choosing the right entry point, you can trick your brain into starting work it would otherwise resist. The smallest possible action is usually the best entry point. Not a small action, the smallest action. What is the absolute minimum you could do that still counts as engaging with this work? Open the document. Write one sentence. Read the first paragraph of what you wrote yesterday. Send one email. Code one function. The action should be so small that it feels almost silly to resist it. You're not committing to complete the task or even to work for any particular duration. You're committing only to this tiny initial action. Something interesting happens when you complete that minimal entry point. The resistance that seemed so solid often evaporates. You open the document intending to write just one sentence, and 20 minutes later, you're still writing. You commit to sending one email, and then you send 3 more. The hard part wasn't the work itself. It was the transition from not working to working. Once you've crossed that threshold, momentum takes over. This isn't always true. Sometimes you complete the minimal action and still don't feel like continuing. That's fine. You met your commitment. You can stop without guilt. But more often than not, starting leads to continuing because the resistance was a product of anticipation rather than reality. The work itself is usually less aversive than the prospect of the work. Minimal entry points let you discover this repeatedly until starting becomes less fraught. Your entry points should be prepared in advance. The previous chapter discussed ending each work session by setting up the next one. Part of that setup is defining exactly what your entry point will be. Write it down somewhere you'll see it when you return. Tomorrow I will open the project file and read the last paragraph I wrote. Tomorrow I will pull up the spreadsheet and enter the first 3 data points. The specificity matters. Vague intentions create decision points where resistance can intervene. Precise entry points eliminate those decision points. The 2-minute rule is a simple application of entry point thinking that can transform how you handle recurring resistance. The rule states that when you're struggling to start something, commit to working on it for just 2 minutes. Not a meaningful work session. Not long enough to accomplish anything substantial. Just 2 minutes. 2 minutes is short enough that almost any resistance becomes absurd. You can tolerate 2 minutes of anything. The commitment is so small that refusing it reveals that your resistance isn't really about the task. It's about some psychological block that needs addressing separately. Most of the time, you won't need to address it, because those 2 minutes will generate enough momentum to carry you forward. The rule works because it separates the decision to start from the decision to continue. These are 2 different decisions with 2 different resistance profiles, but we usually combine them into one. When you think about starting a task, you're implicitly also committing to continuing it for some undefined duration, and your brain resists that open-ended commitment. The 2-minute rule makes the initial commitment explicit and bounded. You're not deciding to work until you're done. You're deciding to work for 2 minutes, after which you can reassess. Once 2 minutes have passed, you'll often find that continuing is easier than stopping. The transition cost has already been paid. Your mind is now engaged with the work. The momentum that was so hard to create has begun. Stopping would actually require effort, the effort of disengaging, context switching, and finding something else to do. Continuing is the path of least resistance, which is exactly where you want productive behavior to be. Some people worry that this approach is a trick they're playing on themselves, and that eventually they'll catch on and it will stop working. This concern reflects a misunderstanding of what's happening. You're not being deceived. You know that 2 minutes often leads to longer sessions. The trick isn't the knowledge, it's the activation. Your rational mind knows that work isn't as bad as it feels before starting, but this knowledge doesn't automatically translate into action. The 2-minute rule provides the activation that bridges knowing and doing. Early wins matter more than their size would suggest. When you begin a work session, the first few minutes set the tone for everything that follows. If those minutes feel frustrating or pointless, you've primed yourself for a difficult session. If they feel productive and satisfying, you've primed yourself for momentum. Structuring your work so that early wins are likely means starting with tasks that are completable, visible, and connected to your larger goals. A completable task is one you can finish in a short time, giving you the satisfaction of crossing something off. A visible task is one with tangible output you can see, giving you evidence of your own productivity. A connected task is one that clearly contributes to something you care about, giving you a sense of meaning rather than busy work. The order in which you tackle tasks affects your psychological state throughout the session. Many people default to starting with easy tasks to warm up before tackling hard ones. This intuition is partially correct. Easy wins do build momentum, but it can backfire if the easy tasks are disconnected from your actual priorities. Answering emails feels productive, but might leave you depleted before your important work begins. A better approach is to start with something that's both achievable and meaningful, giving you the win without the detour. Breaking larger tasks into completion milestones creates opportunities for wins throughout your work, not just at the beginning. If you're writing a report, you might define milestones like completing the outline, drafting the introduction, finishing each major section, and completing the conclusion. Each milestone is a win that refreshes your motivation. Without these defined milestones, you can work for hours with no sense of progress, which depletes motivation even as you're objectively moving forward. The psychology here involves your brain's reward system. Completion triggers a small dopamine release that makes you feel good and motivates continued action. By structuring your work so that completions occur regularly, you're essentially creating a reward schedule that sustains engagement. This isn't about tricking yourself into feeling productive when you're not. It's about designing your interaction with genuinely productive work so that it generates the motivation to continue. Resistance doesn't always yield to small entry points and early wins. Sometimes you face work that is genuinely aversive, tasks you've been avoiding for weeks, projects that feel overwhelming no matter how you frame them, obligations that carry emotional weight beyond their practical difficulty. These situations require additional techniques for overcoming the initial barrier. Reducing the scope is the most powerful technique for overwhelming tasks. When a project feels too large to start, you're responding to the imagined totality of it rather than to any specific action. The solution is to artificially constrain what you're thinking about. You're not going to finish the project today. You're not even going to make major progress. You're going to work on one tiny piece, defined so narrowly that it stops feeling overwhelming. This constraint needs to be explicit and specific. "I'll just work on a small part" is too vague. "I'll write the introduction paragraph and nothing else" is specific enough to reduce overwhelm. "I'll organize the materials for this project without actually starting the work" separates preparation from execution, making each phase less daunting. The narrow focus eliminates the mental weight of everything you're not doing, freeing attention for the small piece you've committed to. Time boxing applies similar logic to duration rather than scope. Instead of working until you're done or until you can't continue, you commit to a fixed period, often short, after which you'll stop regardless of where you are. This bounded commitment reduces resistance because you know exactly how much effort you're signing up for. There's no open-ended slog ahead of you, just a defined interval you can push through. The technique of starting anywhere can break the paralysis that comes from uncertainty about where to begin. When a task has multiple possible starting points and none seems obviously right, the decision itself becomes an obstacle. You can sidestep this by literally picking any starting point at random and beginning there. The work will reveal better approaches as you go. Perfect sequencing isn't necessary for progress, and starting anywhere beats not starting at all. Externalizing the task by talking it through with someone else or writing down your thinking can overcome resistance that stems from confusion. Often the aversion to a task isn't really about the task. It's about unresolved questions lurking inside it. What exactly am I supposed to produce? How will I know when it's done? What's the right approach? These questions create cognitive dissonance that manifests as avoidance. Answering them explicitly, even just by writing them down and thinking through responses, can dissolve resistance that seemed immovable. The middle of a work session is where most people lose momentum. Starting required effort, but you managed it. The early wins gave you some forward motion. Now you're into the body of the work, the part that isn't novel enough to be exciting or close enough to completion to be motivating. This is where focus drifts, where distractions suddenly seem more appealing, where the temptation to check your phone or get a snack or find something else to do becomes strongest. Maintaining engagement through the middle requires different techniques than those used for starting. The resistance here isn't about activation. You're already active. It's about sustaining attention on something that isn't providing immediate rewards. Your brain is wired to seek novelty and variety, and sustained focus on a single task conflicts with that wiring. Structured breaks prevent the depletion that comes from fighting your brain's natural tendencies. Rather than working until you can't work anymore, you plan breaks into your session at regular intervals. The classic approach is to work in focused blocks, often around 25 to 50 minutes, followed by short breaks of 5 to 10 minutes. This rhythm respects your brain's need for variety while maintaining overall forward progress. The timing of breaks matters less than their existence. Some people work best in short sprints with frequent breaks. Others prefer longer blocks with fewer interruptions. Experiment to find your natural rhythm, and then structure your sessions accordingly. The key is that breaks are planned rather than reactive. A planned break is a reward that maintains motivation. A reactive break, where you stop because you couldn't continue, is a concession that undermines your sense of agency. What you do during breaks affects how you return to work. Breaks that involve high-stimulation activities, social media, news, games, make returning to lower-stimulation work harder. Your brain adjusts to the stimulation level and resists returning to something comparatively dull. More effective breaks involve lower stimulation activities: standing, stretching, looking out a window, getting water, taking a short walk. These activities provide genuine rest without creating a stimulation gap you'll have to overcome. Variation within the work itself can sustain engagement when breaks aren't enough. If you're working on a large project, switching between different aspects of it, research, then writing, then editing, then formatting, provides novelty without losing focus on the overall goal. If your work is inherently monotonous, external variation like changing your position, listening to different music, or working in a different location can provide enough stimulation to maintain engagement. The finish is where many people make critical errors that undermine their next session. Having pushed through starting, generated momentum, and maintained focus through the middle, they reach a natural stopping point and simply stop. No preparation for next time. No documentation of where they left off. No setup that would make returning easy. When they come back to the work, they face all the activation barriers again, as if the previous session never happened. Finishing with intention means ending your work session in a way that serves your future self. This includes defining exactly what you'll do next, leaving your work in a state that's easy to resume, and creating any cues or reminders that will help you re-engage quickly. The few minutes this takes at the end of a session can save significant willpower at the beginning of the next one. The specific technique of stopping mid-task rather than at completion points seems counterintuitive but often works well. When you complete a major milestone and then stop, you return to work facing a new beginning. When you stop in the middle of something, you return to work with the task already defined and momentum partially preserved. The incomplete work creates a psychological pull. The mind dislikes leaving things unfinished. That actually helps with reactivation. If stopping mid-task feels wrong to you, an alternative is to stop at completion, but immediately define the next task in concrete terms. Done with the introduction. Tomorrow I'll start with the first section, beginning with the paragraph about supply chain challenges. This specificity reduces the decision load when you return and provides a clear entry point rather than a vague intention to continue. Documenting your mental state and any relevant thoughts at the end of a session prevents the loss of context that normally occurs. Where were you in your thinking? What problems had you identified? What solutions were you considering? Writing these down takes only a minute but preserves hours of mental work that would otherwise evaporate overnight. Returning to this documentation the next day puts you back into the flow much faster than trying to reconstruct everything from scratch. The physical state of your workspace at the end of a session affects the ease of starting the next one. This was covered in the previous chapter, but it bears repeating. Close tabs, file documents, clear clutter, and position everything so that tomorrow's start requires minimal friction. You're not just cleaning up, you're investing in tomorrow's activation energy. Building these techniques into habitual patterns takes them from conscious tactics to automatic behaviors. When you first start using entry points and time boxing and structured breaks, each one requires deliberate thought. Over time, with consistent practice, they become part of how you work. You naturally define minimal entry points because that's just what you do now. You automatically set up your next session because the habit is installed. The installation period requires patience. New techniques feel awkward and artificial before they feel natural. You'll forget to use them sometimes. You'll use them inconsistently. This is normal and doesn't indicate failure. Habits form through repetition, and the repetitions don't need to be perfect. Each time you apply these techniques, you strengthen the neural pathways that will eventually make them automatic. Tracking your use of these methods can accelerate habit formation. A simple record of which techniques you used each day and how your work sessions went creates both accountability and data. You'll start noticing patterns. Which entry points work best for which tasks? How long your optimal work blocks are? What kind of breaks leave you most refreshed? This information lets you refine your approach based on actual experience rather than general principles. Not every technique will work for every person or every type of task. The methods in this chapter are starting points for experimentation, not rigid prescriptions. Try each one, assess its effects, and keep what works while discarding what doesn't. Your personal version of the momentum method will be a customized set of protocols tuned to your specific brain, your specific work, and your specific challenges. The cumulative effect of these tactical changes is a fundamentally different relationship with starting work. Where activation once required summoning willpower you might not have, it now requires following a simple protocol that feels almost effortless. Where momentum once depended on motivation that might or might not show up, it now flows from intelligent structuring of how you engage with tasks. Where finishing once meant simply stopping whenever you ran out of steam, it now means deliberately setting up your future success. None of this replaces the need to actually do the work. These techniques make starting easier, but you still have to start. They make maintaining focus easier, but you still have to focus. The advantage isn't that effort becomes unnecessary. The advantage is that effort goes toward the work itself, rather than toward overcoming unnecessary barriers to beginning the work. Your limited willpower is no longer wasted on the friction of poor task design. It's available for the challenges that actually require it. Chapter 4. Becoming someone who shows up. The strategies you've learned so far, redesigning your environment, engineering low-friction entry points, building momentum through smart task structure, will change your behavior. But changed behavior, on its own, has a shelf life. You can force new patterns for weeks or months through external restructuring and then watch them crumble when circumstances shift or motivation fades. What separates people who sustain strong work ethic over years from those who cycle through temporary improvements is something deeper than tactics. It's identity. The person who shows up consistently isn't constantly deciding to show up. They're expressing who they are. This distinction sounds abstract, but its practical implications are profound. When hard work feels like a departure from your true self, something you have to generate through effort and strategy, every work session is a small battle against your nature. When hard work feels like an expression of your true self, something that flows naturally from who you are, the need for constant self-coercion disappears. You're not fighting yourself anymore. You're being yourself. The goal of this chapter is to show you how to make that shift, not through affirmations or positive thinking, but through the deliberate use of behavior to reshape your self-concept. Your identity isn't fixed. It feels fixed because it's been stable for years, and because the beliefs you hold about yourself are reinforced constantly by the choices you make. But the same mechanism that locked your current identity in place can be used to install a new one. The person you become is largely a product of the actions you repeat. Change the actions consistently enough, and the identity follows. This chapter teaches you how to accelerate that process, protect it from setbacks, and progressively raise your standards until reliable effort becomes simply who you are. Self-concept operates like a thermostat. You have a set point for who you believe yourself to be, and your behavior tends to regulate around that set point. When your actions align with your self-image, everything feels normal. When your actions deviate significantly in either direction, you experience psychological discomfort that pushes you back toward your baseline. This explains the strange phenomenon where people sabotage their own success. Someone lands a dream job that feels above their identity and unconsciously undermines themselves until they're back to familiar territory. Someone starts exercising consistently, begins to feel unusually healthy, and then abandons the routine because it doesn't match their self-image as someone who struggles with fitness. The thermostat pulls them back to their set point, regardless of whether that set point serves them. The same mechanism works in reverse. If your identity includes being someone who works hard, slacking off creates discomfort. Missing a deadline feels wrong, not just practically, but personally. It conflicts with who you believe yourself to be. This discomfort motivates you to return to the behaviors that align with your self-concept. The thermostat protects your identity in both directions, which means that raising your identity set point makes sustained high performance feel natural rather than forced. Changing your identity set point requires understanding how self-concept forms in the first place. You didn't decide who you are through abstract reflection. You learned who you are through observation of your own behavior. Each action you take provides data that your mind uses to update its model of your identity. Repeated actions carry more weight than isolated ones. Actions taken under difficult circumstances carry more weight than actions taken when conditions are easy. Over time, the accumulated data creates a stable picture of who you are, which then influences future behavior, which then reinforces the picture. This feedback loop can work for you or against you. If you've been inconsistent about work, each instance of slacking off has reinforced an identity as someone who slacks off. That identity then makes future slacking more likely, because it's consistent with who you believe yourself to be. Breaking this loop requires inserting different data, consistently enough and long enough that your self-concept has to update. The environmental and tactical changes from previous chapters create the conditions for this new data. This chapter is about deliberately using that data to rewrite your identity. Evidence tracking accelerates identity change by making your new behaviors visible and countable. Left to its own devices, your mind tends to weight negative data more heavily than positive data. You might work consistently for 2 weeks and then miss a day, and that missed day dominates your self-assessment. Evidence tracking corrects this bias by creating an objective record that you can review. The simplest form of evidence tracking is a streak counter. Each day you perform your target behavior, showing up and working as intended. You mark it on a calendar or in an app. The visual representation of consecutive days creates a form of investment that makes breaking the streak feel costly. You're not just missing a day, you're breaking something you've built. This loss aversion works in your favor by adding emotional weight to consistency. Streak tracking has a vulnerability, though. When the streak breaks, and it will, eventually, the psychological impact can be severe. All those consecutive days suddenly feel erased, and you're back to zero. This is why evidence tracking should focus on accumulation rather than just streaks. Track the total number of days you've shown up. Track the percentage of intended work sessions you've completed. Track the hours logged or the output produced. These metrics can survive individual misses because they represent cumulative evidence rather than fragile chains. Your tracking system should be visible enough that you encounter it regularly. A notebook kept in a drawer won't influence your behavior the way a chart on your wall will. A spreadsheet you rarely open won't carry the weight of a simple tally marked each day where you can see it. The evidence needs to be present in your environment, reminding you of who you're becoming. The records you create serve a second function beyond motivation. They provide ammunition against your own doubts. When your mind tells you that you're not really someone who works hard, you have concrete data to contradict it. 15 days last month, 42 sessions this quarter, 300 hours this year. The numbers don't lie, and they don't forget. They provide an objective anchor when your subjective self-assessment tries to drag you back to old identities. The stories you tell about yourself shape the identity you inhabit. These stories play constantly in the background, interpreting your experiences in ways that confirm or challenge your self-concept. Most people never examine these narratives consciously, which means they're being shaped by stories they didn't choose and might not endorse if they thought about them. The story of a chronic underperformer sounds something like this. I've never been good at sticking with things. I start strong, but always lose steam. I wish I could be more disciplined, but that's just not who I am. This narrative interprets every slip as confirmation and every success as an exception. It creates a filter that lets in evidence of laziness while dismissing evidence of effort. Changing your story doesn't mean lying to yourself. It means choosing an interpretation of your history and your current actions that supports who you want to become rather than who you've been. The same facts can be narrated differently. I used to be inconsistent, but I'm building new patterns. Each time I show up is evidence that I'm changing. The person I was doesn't have to be the person I'm becoming. This narrative interprets every effort as confirmation of change and every slip as a temporary deviation from a new trajectory. The key word in constructive self-narration is yet. You're not someone who works hard yet. You haven't developed reliable discipline yet. The addition of this single word transforms fixed statements about identity into dynamic statements about trajectory. It acknowledges where you are without defining where you have to stay. How you explain your behavior to others also shapes your identity, because social declarations create accountability and commitment. If you tell people you're working on becoming more disciplined, you've made a public claim that creates pressure to align your actions with your words. If you tell people you're just not a hard worker, you've given yourself social permission to stay that way. Be intentional about the identity you claim in conversation. The person you describe yourself as tends to become the person you are. Setbacks are inevitable, and how you handle them determines whether they become temporary obstacles or permanent derailments. The critical moment isn't the setback itself, it's the interpretation that follows. Get the interpretation wrong, and a single bad day becomes proof that you haven't really changed. Get it right, and the same bad day becomes a minor bump on a long road. The most destructive response to setbacks is what might be called identity catastrophizing. You miss a workout or fail to complete a work session, and your mind immediately extrapolates. I knew I couldn't really change. This proves I'm still the same old lazy person. Why did I ever think I could be different? This interpretation takes isolated data and uses it to rewrite your entire self-concept. It's wildly disproportionate to the actual event, but it feels compelling because it matches your historical identity. A more accurate interpretation recognizes that setbacks are information, not verdicts. Something got in the way of your intended behavior. What was it? Were you depleted from other demands? Did your environment fail to support you? Was the task itself poorly designed? Did life simply happen in a way that made your plans impossible? These questions lead to useful adjustments. The catastrophic interpretation leads only to despair. The concept of the identity floor helps protect against catastrophizing. Your identity floor is the minimum behavior you'll accept from yourself, even on your worst days. Maybe your normal standard is 2 hours of focused work, but your floor is 15 minutes. Maybe you usually complete 5 tasks, but your floor is completing 1. When circumstances push you toward a bad day, hitting the floor still counts as showing up. You haven't violated your identity. You've maintained it at the minimum acceptable level. Having a defined floor changes the psychology of difficult days. Without a floor, any reduction from your standard feels like failure. With a floor, reductions can be strategic retreats that preserve your streak and your self-concept. You're not failing, you're executing your contingency plan. This reframe prevents the shame spiral that often follows substandard performance. The speed of recovery matters more than the avoidance of setbacks. Everyone misses days. Everyone has periods of lower performance. What distinguishes people with strong work identities is that they return to their baseline quickly. A bad day doesn't become a bad week. A bad week doesn't become a bad month. The return to normal is treated as the expectation rather than as a heroic effort. Training yourself to recover quickly is more valuable than training yourself to never slip. Raising your standards progressively prevents the complacency that can set in once new behaviors become normal. If your identity stabilizes around someone who does the minimum, you've improved, but you've also created a new ceiling. The goal is an identity that continuously expands its sense of what's normal. Progressive standards work by introducing small increases once current behaviors feel automatic. You've been consistently working for an hour each day, and it no longer requires willpower. It's just what you do. Now you experiment with 90 minutes. At first, this feels like a stretch. With repetition, it becomes the new normal. Then you consider 2 hours. Each increase builds on the last, and each becomes part of your updated identity. The timing of increases matters. Moving too fast creates unsustainable demands that lead to failure and regression. Moving too slowly allows complacency to set in. The right time to increase is when your current standard feels genuinely automatic, when maintaining it requires no conscious effort or willpower expenditure. If you're still struggling to hit your current target, raising it will only create more struggle. Quality standards can increase alongside quantity standards. Early in your identity shift, just showing up might be the goal. Later, showing up with focus becomes the standard. Later still, showing up with focus and producing high-quality output becomes expected. These qualitative progressions are harder to track, but equally important for identity development. Comparison with your past self is more useful than comparison with others for progressive standard setting. Other people's capacities, circumstances, and starting points differ from yours in ways that make comparison misleading. Your own history provides a relevant baseline. Are you working more consistently than you did 6 months ago? Are you handling resistance better than you used to? Is your sense of what's normal higher than it was when you started? These comparisons measure actual progress rather than arbitrary external standards. The role models you observe influence the identity you develop, even when you're not consciously trying to learn from them. Exposure to people with strong work ethics adjusts your sense of what's possible and normal. Their standards become reference points that pull your own standards upward. This doesn't require knowing high performers personally. Reading about them, watching interviews with them, or studying their approaches all provide useful exposure. The key is to focus on their systems and habits rather than their outcomes. Outcomes can feel intimidatingly distant, but systems are immediately relevant. How do they structure their days? How do they handle resistance? What do they do when motivation is low? These tactical insights combine with identity modeling to reshape both what you do and who you believe you can be. The people in your immediate environment matter too. Spending time around hardworking people normalizes hard work. Spending time around people who constantly complain about their jobs and do the minimum normalizes that pattern instead. You can't always choose your colleagues, but you have more control over your broader social environment than you might realize. Seeking out communities, online or offline, where high standards are the norm, exposes you to identity-shaping influences that support your goals. Be cautious about role models who seem to operate without struggle. Accounts of people who love every minute of their work and never face resistance can actually be discouraging because they suggest that if you're finding things hard, something is wrong with you. More useful role models are those who acknowledge difficulty while demonstrating persistence. Their example teaches that struggle is normal and compatible with strong work identity. The internal dialogue you maintain about work affects your relationship with effort. Most people have a running commentary in their heads about the tasks they're facing, and this commentary is often reflexively negative. I don't want to do this. This is going to be hard. I wish I could be doing something else. Each of these thoughts reinforces an identity as someone who resists work rather than someone who engages with it. Shifting internal dialogue isn't about forcing false positivity. It's about catching reflexive negativity and questioning whether it's accurate or useful. I don't want to do this might be true in the moment, but it's also irrelevant. You've committed to doing it regardless of momentary preferences. This is going to be hard might be accurate, but it's also priming you to experience difficulty. I could be doing something else ignores that the something else would bring its own challenges and likely more guilt. More useful internal dialogue focuses on the immediate present rather than projected difficulty. What's the next action? Directs attention productively. I've done this before, reminds you of existing capability. This is what I do now, reinforces your emerging identity. None of these statements are false or forcibly positive. They're simply more useful framings that support engagement rather than resistance. The tone of your internal dialogue matters as much as its content. Speaking to yourself harshly, criticizing failures, demanding better performance through insult, might seem like motivation, but it's actually counterproductive for most people. Harsh self-talk triggers defensive responses that make engagement harder. A firm but encouraging internal voice, the kind you'd use with a friend who's struggling, tends to produce better results. You can hold high standards without being cruel about enforcing them. Physical state influences identity expression more than most people acknowledge. When you're well-rested, well-fed, and physically comfortable, showing up as your best self is relatively easy. When you're exhausted, hungry, or unwell, the identity you've been building faces a much harder test. Understanding this connection helps you protect your identity by protecting your physical condition. Sleep is the foundation of everything else. The evidence on this is overwhelming and consistent. Insufficient sleep degrades every aspect of cognitive function, including the self-regulation capacities that let you act according to your intentions rather than your impulses. Treating sleep as negotiable, something to sacrifice when demands increase, is treating your identity as negotiable. Protecting adequate sleep is an identity-level commitment, not merely a health preference. Exercise, diet, and stress management all influence your capacity to show up as the person you're trying to become. This isn't a health book, so detailed recommendations aren't appropriate here. The relevant point is that your identity expression depends on your physical resources. Neglecting these resources guarantees that your new identity will be harder to maintain. Taking care of them stacks the odds in your favor. Recognizing the physical dimension of identity also helps with compassion during setbacks. If you struggled on a day when you were sleep-deprived, sick, or overwhelmed by stress, that struggle isn't evidence of character failure. It's evidence that your physical resources were depleted. Address the resource issue, and your identity expression will recover. The transformation from someone who struggles with work ethic to someone who shows up reliably doesn't happen in a single moment of commitment. It happens gradually through accumulated actions that slowly update your self-concept. Each time you work when you didn't feel like it, each time you choose your systems over your impulses, each time you recover quickly from a setback, these moments are deposits into an identity that compounds over time. You won't notice the change while it's happening. Like physical growth, identity change is invisible at the scale of days or weeks. But looking back over months, you'll realize that things that once required willpower now happen automatically. Behaviors that once felt like departures from who you were now feel like expressions of who you are. The struggle hasn't disappeared, but its nature has changed. You're no longer trying to become someone who works hard. You are someone who works hard, and your behavior follows naturally from that fact. This book has given you the tools to make that transformation, the environmental design that reduces friction, the tactical approaches that build momentum, and the identity principles that make changes stick. The tools are useless without application, and application is something only you can provide. But you now have something you didn't have before, a coherent system that works with human psychology rather than against it. That system, consistently applied, will produce the person you're capable of becoming, not through force, not through willpower, through intelligent design of your environment, your tasks, and your sense of self.